A murder without a footprint dares Poirot's brilliance. Welcome to Café Echoes. I am your host, Silas Graves. Join the conversation. Comment where you're listening from. Your voices matter here. Now, let us begin. I had arranged to meet Hercule Poirot for tea at the Savoy. Poirot was already installed. Back straight, moustaches symmetrical, gloves placed beside his cup as if they too required a saucer. "Mon ami Hastings," he said, disapproval wrapped in affection. "You are 3 minutes late. Disorder creeps in, first in the minutes, then in the morals." Before I could reply, a veiled woman in dove grey approached our table, followed by an older gentleman with the stiff dignity of an ex-officer and a younger man in a tailored suit whose watchful eyes missed nothing. "Monsieur Poirot?" The woman's voice shook. "They told me, at Scotland Yard, you notice what others do not." Poirot rose, exact rather than hurried. "Madame, I notice what is there. Sit, I beg of you." She sat as though the chair might betray her. "I am Lady Celeste Marrodine. This is Colonel Roderick Marrodine, my husband's brother, and Mr. Felix Crane, our solicitor." Poirot's eyes rested on each in turn as lightly as a brush stroke. "You have had a misfortune. My husband is dead." Poirot did not move, but the air changed. "Dead," he repeated softly, "is a strong word." "It is the only one." She produced a folded telegram and pushed it across. "They found him this morning at Marrodine House, in his study, sitting at his desk as if he had fallen asleep. But there was no blood, no struggle, no sign of anything at all. It is as if death merely arrived, took its seat, and waited." Colonel Marrodine's voice cut in, clipped and military. "The doctor says heart failure. The police are satisfied." "Then why come to me?" Poirot asked. Lady Celeste's hands tightened on her handbag. "Because my husband was 47 and he walked 10 miles before breakfast. Because last night he told me, quite calmly, that he had discovered something that would clear the house of vermin." Those were his words. Mr. Crane cleared his throat. "Sir Alistair was forthright. He had made enemies." Poirot inclined his head. "Enemies are common. But you spoke of no sign." "No sign whatever," Colonel Marrodine said. "The window was closed and bolted. The door was locked from the inside. There are no footprints in the garden beneath that window. None. Yet something is missing." Lady Celeste opened her handbag and drew out a small velvet case, empty. "The Marrodine signet ring," she whispered. "It belonged to his father. A heavy thing, gold, with the family crest. Sir Alistair never removed it." "And papers," Mr. Crane added quickly. "Certain documents, private, were in the safe in the study. This morning the safe stood open. The papers have vanished, yet there is no damage to the lock." "The combination?" Poirot asked. "Known only to Sir Alistair," Crane said, then hesitated. "And to myself, by necessity." Poirot raised a hand. "We swear later, monsieur. First we think." Lady Celeste's composure cracked. "They look at me," she said. "The servants do. Roderick does." She glanced at the colonel. "They say perhaps I quarreled with him. Perhaps I gave him something. But I was in my room all evening. I heard him go to his study at 11. I heard the key turn. This morning at 8, when he did not answer, we broke in. He sat there, dead. The key was still in the lock on the inside." "A locked room," Poirot murmured. "A death without struggle, a theft without entry, and no trace." Colonel Marrodine's face reddened. "It is not a sensational business, monsieur. My brother was a peer. We do not desire scandal." Poirot's smile was small, polite, and curiously hard. "Colonel, scandal is not a thing one desires. It is a thing one earns." Lady Celeste leaned closer. At the edge of her sleeve I noticed a faint smudge of pale powder, chalk or plaster, perhaps. "Will you come?" she asked, before they closed the matter. Before whatever killed him walks away invisible. Poirot studied her for a beat that felt like a measurement. Then he nodded once, as though setting a book precisely upon a shelf. Yes, madame. For when a murder leaves no trace, it is because the trace is not on the floor, but in the mind. As we rose, Colonel Marrodane straightened his shoulders as if for inspection. Mr. Crane exhaled. Relief or irritation, I could not tell. Lady Celeste kept her veil down, but her hands had stopped shaking. Poirot turned to me, his eyes bright with that particular flame, the pleasure of a puzzle presented neatly. "Hastings," he said, "pack your bag. We go to Marrodane House, and we shall see how one makes death appear orderly." Within the hour, we were in a taxi, Poirot's valise balanced on his knees like a judgment. He asked, without looking up, to whether Marrodane House possessed a new conservatory. Lady Celeste, surprised, said yes. Recently plastered, still smelling of lime. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Good," he murmured. "Then perhaps, Hastings, the no trace is only because it has been dusted away. The one who dusted it will cough." The taxi carried us away from the bright clatter of the Strand into lanes bordered by bare hedges and winter fields. Lady Celeste sat opposite me, motionless except for the small betraying movements of her fingers on the clasp of her handbag. Mr. Crane spoke twice, both times to correct a detail as though reality might be improved by amendment, and then subsided, watching Poirot as one watches a silent judge. Poirot gazed out of the window with the air of a man arranging facts into neat rows. When Marrodane House appeared, and it did so with an insolent assurance, iron gates, a gravel sweep, stone steps worn by generations that had never imagined their own end. Yet as soon as we entered the hall, I felt that something in the building had shifted. The servants stood too still. The air smelled of wax and old smoke, and beneath it lay a dry, chalky tang that caught in the throat. Fresh plaster, I thought, and remembered Poirot's question in the cab. Colonel Marrodane met us at once, rigid as if he commanded the portraits on the walls. "Inspector Japp is here," he said. "The doctor has been. They're inclined to call it natural." "And you, Colonel?" Poirot asked. "I'm inclined to finish this," the Colonel snapped. "My brother's name—" Poirot lifted a hand. "We speak of truth first." Inspector Japp came forward from the drawing-room doorway. "Poirot, I'm glad you've come. It's a strange business, this. Strange enough that I didn't fancy leaving it to the local boys." Poirot's head tilted. "The study, yes?" They took us along a corridor where the carpet drank up sound. The door at the far end bore fresh scars on the lock plate and a splintered edge where force had been used. Japp saw my glance. "Locked from the inside, Hastings. Key in the lock. They broke it open this morning when he didn't answer." Inside, the room had the harsh neatness of a man who distrusted comfort. Dark shelves, a large desk positioned squarely before the window, a safe concealed behind a painting now propped awkwardly on a chair, and at the desk, as if still presiding over his papers, Sir Alistair Marrodane sat dead. I have seen death before, but there was something peculiarly unsettling in its tidiness here. No spilled ink, no scattered pages, no overturned chair. His head had drooped forward a little, as though sleep had overtaken him in the middle of a thought. His hands rested on the blotter, and on the left hand the skin showed a pale band where a ring should have been. Poirot approached with extraordinary calm. He did not touch the body at first. He looked at the lips, the eyelids, the faint discoloration at the fingertips. Then his gaze moved, measuring the room as though it were a diagram. "The window," he said. It was shut tight, the bolt fastened. Outside, the lawn lay damp and darkened by frost. "No footprints," Japp said. "Soft ground, too. If anyone had been under there, we'd have had a mark. There's nothing." "And the safe?" Poirot asked. Mr. Crane answered quickly. Open. Papers missing. Ah, private papers? Poirot's eyes went to the safe's dial. No scratches. No violence. The combination. Sir Alistair alone, Crane said, then added, and myself by necessity. I am his solicitor. The Colonel's mouth tightened. My brother trusted Crane. Poirot nodded as if accepting only the words. Who found him? Celeste noticed he hadn't rung for his tea, the Colonel said. At 8, we knocked. No answer. I forced the door. And you entered first, Poirot said. I did. Poirot's attention went to the key, now lying on the desk. Where was it exactly? In the lock, Lady Celeste said, voice thin. On the inside. I saw it before Roderick, before the door gave. Poirot's fingers, protected by his handkerchief, touched the key briefly, then the lock. And in the night, no one heard anything. No cry, no fall? There was nothing, Lady Celeste whispered. Only silence. Jap shifted his feet. Doctor says heart failure, no obvious sign of poison, but papers missing and ring missing, doesn't fit, unless it's robbery after the fact. Poirot moved to the fireplace. The grate was cold, but on the hearthstone lay a fine scatter of grey dust, too cleanly placed to be mere soot. He lifted a pinch of the dust, rubbed it between finger and thumb, then glanced, very quickly, at Lady Celeste's sleeve. She followed his look and coloured. The conservatory, she said. I went there this morning. I could not bear being watched. The conservatory is newly plastered, Poirot murmured. Yes, she said. It is still unfinished. Poirot straightened. Then we go there soon. But first, Jap, I wish to speak with the valet and the housekeeper. Now, in a house where everything is ordered, it is the person who cleans who knows what was disturbed. He looked once more at Sir Alistair's bare hand. And I wish to learn who in this house had the right to touch him. For death is not tidy by nature. Someone has made it appear so. Poirot began with the servants, not in the study but in the small morning room overlooking the frost-whitened lawn. He insisted upon drawing the curtains himself, aligning their edges with minute care, before seating the witnesses as if arranging a still life. The housekeeper, Mrs. Elmsworth, was a woman of pressed lips and vigilant eyes. The valet, Parkins, thin and pale, kept his hands folded as though they might otherwise betray him. You will tell me, Poirot said gently, not what you think is important, but what you noticed. Mrs. Elmsworth spoke first, when she had retired at 10. Sir Alistair was already in his study, working as he often did. She heard nothing in the night. In the morning she noticed the safe door open when she brought the firewood, but thought the master had left it so. Poirot asked how she knew the safe was open. She hesitated, then admitted she dusted the room daily and knew its usual aspect. The open safe offended her sense of order. And the ring? Poirot asked. She shook her head. I never saw Sir Alistair without it, sir. Not even in bed. Parkins said little. He had served Sir Alistair for 3 years. The master dismissed him at 9:30. There was nothing unusual, except that Sir Alistair had asked him twice whether the conservatory door was locked. Poirot's eyebrows lifted a fraction. Why would he ask that? Jap said. Parkins swallowed. I don't know. No, sir? He said there were drafts. Poirot thanked them and dismissed them, then turned at once to the conservatory. The room smelled strongly of lime and damp stone. Unfinished walls stood pale and raw, and a light scattering of plaster dust lay across the tiled floor like the aftermath of a snowfall. Poirot did not step inside immediately. He examined the threshold, then the handles of the glass doors, then the bolt. At last he entered, placing his feet with delicate care. Someone has been here since the plaster dried, he said softly. Jap looked about. Anyone could have walked through. Yes, Poirot replied, but not anyone wished to. He crouched and indicated a faint disturbance in the dust near the far wall. Here. A man stood. He waited. He touched the wall, perhaps to steady himself. Lady Celeste pressed her hand to her mouth. You mean someone hid here? Poirot did not answer directly. He moved to the inner door that led back into the corridor. It was unlocked. From here, he said, one may reach the study without crossing the lawn, without leaving a footprint. One must only know the house. Colonel Marauden's face darkened. You are suggesting an intruder inside my own home. I suggest, Poirot said calmly, that death did not come through the window. They returned to the study. Poirot stood before the desk, his gaze fixed on the blotter. Sir Alistair was threatened, he said. He said he would clear the house of vermin. He had papers proving something. He kept them in the safe. He wore a ring that signified authority, inheritance, identity. And someone wanted those things, Japp said. Someone who feared exposure, Poirot replied. But observe, there is no struggle. Sir Alistair trusted his visitor. He unlocked the door. He admitted them. Then why lock it again? Hastings asked. Poirot smiled faintly. Because the dead man did not. He requested to see Lady Celeste alone. In the small drawing room, she sat rigid, eyes bright with unshed tears. Poirot spoke kindly, but there was steel beneath it. Madame, your sleeve this morning bore plaster dust. You said you went to the conservatory after your husband was found. But the dust on your sleeve was disturbed, not settled. Her breath caught. I went there in the night, she said. I could not sleep. Alistair frightened me. He said he had discovered something about Roderick, about the money. I was afraid. Afraid enough to go to the conservatory, Poirot said. Said, but not afraid enough to go to your husband. She shook her head. I did not know what he meant. I only knew he was angry. Poirot inclined his head. Thank you, madame. Later, he spoke with Mr. Crane in the library. The solicitor was precise, indignant at the implication of suspicion. Yes, he knew the safe combination. Yes, he had advised Sir Alistair regarding certain investments involving the Colonel. No, he had not seen the missing papers. Poirot listened, eyes half closed. When at last we were alone, I asked the question burning in me. Do you believe Sir Alistair was poisoned? Poirot clasped his hands. Perhaps. But poison is only the method. The true question is this. Who needed Sir Alistair to die quietly, without trace, and who had the confidence to sit with him while he did? He looked toward the corridor where the conservatory lay hidden behind glass. And who, Hastings, would think first of draughts and of dust and of doors left conveniently unlocked? I felt the house listening, holding its breath, as though the walls themselves waited for Poirot to name the unseen guest at last. Poirot remained unusually silent through the remainder of the afternoon, allowing Inspector Japp to fill the void with procedural murmurs while the house settled into a tense, artificial calm. Servants moved with exaggerated care, as though noise itself might incriminate them. At Poirot's suggestion, Sir Alistair's body was left undisturbed for the moment, the study sealed not merely by police order, but by a palpable sense of restraint, as though the room contained a thought not yet fully formed. It was near dusk when Poirot requested that Colonel Maraudin join us in the study. The colonel arrived promptly, his bearing rigid, his eyes restless. Poirot offered him a chair, which he declined, choosing instead to stand by the mantelpiece where his brother's portrait gazed down with austere disapproval. Colonel, Poirot began, you and your brother were not close. Roderick's jaw tightened. We were brothers. That is closeness enough. Yet you disagreed, Poirot said mildly. About money, about a management, about the past. The colonel's hand closed on the marble edge of the mantel. Alistair believed himself infallible. And you believed him reckless, Poirot replied. You feared what he might uncover. That is speculation, the colonel snapped. Most everything is speculation, Poirot said gently, until it is truth. He turned then to the desk, opening a drawer that Japp had already examined. From within, he removed a small leather notebook. This was overlooked, Poirot said. Not hidden, merely disregarded. Japp frowned. Nothing of interest in there. Accounts. Dates. Poirot smiled. Dates are very interesting, especially when they stop. He flipped to the final page where a single line was written in Sir Alistair's firm hand. Poirot did not read it aloud. Instead, he closed the book and returned it to the drawer with deliberate care. Last night, Poirot continued, Sir Alistair summoned someone. Not by letter, but by expectation. He trusted this person. He believed himself in control. The colonel laughed sharply. You make my brother sound arrogant. I make him sound human, Poirot replied. He unlocked the door. He admitted his visitor. He even locked it again, because order mattered to him. And then? I asked. And then, Poirot said, he was given something. Perhaps a cordial, perhaps a powder dissolved in wine, something tasteless, something slow. Japp shifted. Doctor found no sign. Because he did not know where to look, Poirot said. The poison was chosen for its neatness. A knock interrupted them. Parkins entered, pale and agitated. Beg pardon, sir. There's been a disturbance. They followed him to the upper corridor. Outside Lady Celeste's room stood Mrs. Elmsworth, wringing her hands. On the bed lay the velvet case that had once held the signet ring. I found it in the linen cupboard, the housekeeper said, tucked behind the sheets. The room seemed to tighten around us. Poirot lifted the empty case, examining it closely. Someone wished this to be found, he said softly. But not yet. Lady Celeste arrived moments later, her composure fraying. I never put it there, she said. I swear it. I believe you, Poirot replied, and for the first time that day his voice carried unmistakable authority. This is not your game. Colonel Marrowdane's face had gone grey. This is absurd. Are you suggesting someone planted it? Yes, Poirot said. To create confusion, to test reactions. His eyes rested on the colonel. Roderick met the gaze, then looked away. That evening, as lamps were lit and shadows gathered in the corners of the house, Poirot asked that no one leave. He dined sparingly, asked few questions, and watched. And Lady Celeste barely touched her food. Mr. Crane spoke too much, filling silence with legal trivialities. The colonel drank brandy with the air of a man fortifying himself. Later, in the drawing-room, Poirot spoke to me in a low voice. The ring is not lost, he said. It is a symbol, power, inheritance. It was taken to remind Sir Alistair of something, or someone. You think the killer returned it? No, Poirot said. I think the killer never needed it. As if summoned by the thought, a shout rang out from the hall. We hurried to find Mr. Crane standing by the telephone table, receiver dangling, his face white with shock. The papers, he stammered. They're gone from my briefcase. I brought copies. They were with me this morning. Now they're gone. Poirot's eyes gleamed, not with triumph, but with grim satisfaction. Ah, he said. So the game accelerates. Japp swore under his breath. That means someone in the house. Yes, Poirot said. And someone who moves freely. Someone who understands trust, routine, and the comfort of familiarity. He looked around at them all, one by one, his gaze lingering just long enough to unsettle. Tonight, he said quietly, someone will make a mistake. And when they do, Hastings, we shall see at last the trace that death could not erase. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, impatient and probing, while within Marrowdene House every breath seemed measured, every glance weighted, as though the truth itself paced the corridors, waiting for one unguarded step tonight only. Night deepened over Marrowdean House, and with it the sense that the building itself leaned inward to listen. And Poirot suggested cards in the drawing room, a proposal that startled everyone, yet no one refused. The Colonel dealt with rigid precision, Mr. Crane shuffled nervously, and Lady Celeste watched the patterns form and dissolve as though fate lay between the suits. Poirot played indifferently, losing small sums without concern, his eyes far more interested in hands than in cards. It was nearly 10 when Mrs. Elmsworth entered to announce that the household would retire. Poirot raised a finger. No one was to leave yet, he said politely. There would be a final walk through the house. Nothing more. The excuse was security. The purpose, I knew, was something else entirely. They began with the conservatory. Under lamplight, the plaster dust gleamed faintly, undisturbed since afternoon. Poirot nodded, satisfied, and locked the door himself, I pocketing the key. From there they moved through the corridor toward the study. Halfway along, Lady Celeste faltered. She steadied herself against the wall, her hand brushing the paneling. Poirot noticed, as he noticed everything. In the study, the air felt colder. Poirot crossed directly to the desk and opened the drawer containing the notebook. He did not read it, but he placed it deliberately in his pocket. The Colonel stiffened. Mr. Crane opened his mouth, then closed it again. "You object?" Poirot asked mildly. "That book is my brother's," the Colonel said. "And therefore part of his mind," Poirot replied, "which is precisely what interests me." A sudden sound cut through the room, sharp and unmistakable. The click of a door closing somewhere nearby. Jap was already moving, revolver half drawn, and they hurried into the corridor and found the conservatory door shut. "But you locked it," I said. "C'est sûr." Poirot produced the key. "Indeed." The glass doors trembled slightly, as though touched from within. Poirot opened them at once. The conservatory was empty, but on the pale floor the plaster dust told its story clearly now. Footprints, recent and hurried, led from the far wall to the inner door. At the threshold, they stopped. "Someone waited," Poirot said quietly. "Someone listened." They followed the trail back into the house. It led not toward the servants' stairs, nor toward Lady Celeste's room, but to the small side library rarely used after dinner. Inside, Mr. Crane stood frozen, papers scattered at his feet. "I heard someone," he said wildly. "I came to look." Poirot stooped and picked up a single sheet. "You came to hide," he corrected gently. "These are copies of the missing papers. You never lost them. You carried them with you." Crane's composure collapsed. "I had to protect myself. Sir Alistair was mad. He meant to ruin us all." "Us?" Poirot said softly. Crane laughed, a brittle sound. "Roderick's investments. Illegal. Reckless. I managed them. Alistair found out. He summoned me last night. He threatened exposure." "And you killed him," Jap said. Crane shook his head. "No. I gave him something to calm him. A draught. I left him alive." Poirot's eyes hardened. "You gave him a poison that mimicked nature. You counted on his heart to fail quietly. But you did not take the ring." Crane stared. "I didn't need it." "Exactly," Poirot said. "The ring was taken later, to frighten, to mislead, by someone who arrived after you left." All eyes turned to the Colonel. Roderick's face was livid. "This is madness." Poirot stepped closer. "You followed Crane through the conservatory. You waited in the dust. You entered when the study was unlocked again. Your brother was already dying. You watched. Then you took the ring and the originals to secure your inheritance." The Colonel's shoulders sagged. "He was going to destroy everything," he whispered. "The family. The name." "And so you finished what Crane began," Poirot said. "One crime concealed by another." Silence fell, heavy and final. Jap moved to arrest them both. Lady Celeste sank into a chair, weeping softly. Later, as the house at last released its breath, Poirot stood by the window. "Order," he said quietly, "is what men seek. But when they worship it too greatly, Hastings, they will commit any disorder to preserve the illusion." I looked at him, at the careful line of his mustache and the weariness briefly revealed beneath it, and I understood that the case was already complete in his mind. The house would empty, scandal would be managed, and justice would proceed in its imperfect human way. Yet Marrowdean House would never be orderly again. Somewhere in its walls, the echo of quiet footsteps would remain, and the memory of a man who trusted too much. Poirot turned from the window and reached for his gloves, aligning them with habitual precision. Tomorrow, he said, would be for statements and signatures. Tonight was for silence. We left the room together, and behind us, the lamps burned steadily, illuminating a study that at last held nothing more dangerous than the truth. Outside, the night received us calmly, indifferent to guilt, grief, or the triumph of reason. Morning came to Marrowdean House with a thin, reluctant light, as though the sun itself hesitated to intrude upon what had been settled in darkness. The Colonel and Mr. Crane had been taken away before dawn, their departures quiet, almost courteous, as if the house demanded civility even from disgrace. Lady Celeste did not witness it. She remained in her room, the door ajar, sitting very straight beside the window, watching frost melt from the lawn with an expression emptied of surprise. Poirot was already awake when I found him in the breakfast room. He had arranged the silver precisely and was correcting the alignment of a vase that stood a fraction too near the edge of the table. He looked up with a mild smile. "Order must be restored, Hastings," he said, "even when it is temporary." Inspector Japp joined us shortly after, his manner brisk but subdued. Statements would be taken later in London. The doctor would revise his report. There would be an inquest, discreetly handled. Japp shook his head. "Two men responsible for one death," he said. "Hard to explain that neatly." Poirot poured himself coffee. "Truth is rarely neat. It is only logic that pretends to be." Lady Celeste came down at last, pale but composed. She thanked Poirot formally, then with a sudden impulse took his hand. "You gave him back his voice," she said. "They would have called it his heart. You would not let them." Poirot inclined his head. "Your husband wished to speak, madame, even in death." She nodded once, then asked the question she had clearly rehearsed all night. "Did he suffer?" Poirot considered her gravely. "Less than he feared, more than he deserved. That is often the balance." Later, we walked once more through the conservatory. Servants were already sweeping away the plaster dust, erasing the last visible memory of waiting feet. Poirot watched them for a moment. "It is strange," he said, "how men believe that by removing a trace, they remove responsibility. Yet the mind remembers what the floor forgets." At the gate, Poirot paused and looked back at the house. "Sir Alistair was a man who trusted order more than people," he said. "His brother trusted blood more than law. His solicitor trusted intelligence more than conscience. Each made the same error. They believed themselves exceptions." "And Lady Celeste?" I asked. Poirot sighed softly. "She trusted love. That is the most dangerous trust of all, because it blinds without intention." The taxi arrived to take us back to London. As we drove away, Marrowdean House diminished into stone and shadow, already assuming the air of a place that would soon be spoken of carefully, then rarely, then not at all. Poirot sat back, closing his eyes. "You are tired," I said. "No," he replied. "I am finished." In the silence that followed, I reflected that Poirot's victories were never triumphs in the common sense. They left behind no elation, only a precise melancholy, like a room restored too late to prevent the fire. Yet there was comfort, too, in knowing that chaos, however briefly, had been named and understood. As London rose to meet us, Poirot opened his eyes and adjusted his gloves. "Come, Hastings," he said lightly. "We shall have luncheon. Yet one must not allow tragedy to interfere entirely with digestion." And so the affair ended, not with noise or spectacle, but with a return to proportion. Death had left no trace upon the floor, but it had left its impression upon every soul it touched. Poirot, alone among us, accepted that burden calmly, carrying it away like an invisible file, already arranged, already complete. The following afternoon brought a letter, delivered to Poirot's rooms by a young constable who seemed relieved to surrender it. Poirot examined the envelope before opening it, noting the firmness of the hand, the absence of hesitation in the address. "Lady Celeste," he said. "She has decided not to wait for the inquest to speak." He read in silence while I watched the fire. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the mantel clock. "She writes that Sir Alister discovered the fraud 6 weeks ago, not last night. He waited because he wished to be certain. That delay killed him." "You mean," I said slowly, "that if he had acted sooner, he would have lived?" Poirot replied. "Yes." The inquest followed 2 days later. The verdict, as Japp predicted, was measured and mercifully restrained. The newspapers spoke of sudden illness, of unfortunate entanglements, of a peer betrayed by those closest to him. Poirot read none of it. He spent the morning polishing his shoes and correcting a minor misalignment in his bookcase. Yet there was one matter unresolved, at least in my mind. That evening, as we dined quietly, I asked him what had first convinced him that Sir Alister's death was not natural. Poirot considered, cutting his fish with mathematical precision. "Because nature is rarely symmetrical," he said. "Sir Alister died as he lived, in perfect order. Too perfect. The key in the lock, the chair aligned, the papers undisturbed. Death does not arrange itself so politely. And the plaster dust. A distraction," Poirot said. "Useful, but not decisive. It showed movement, not intention." I pressed him. "Then what was decisive?" He smiled faintly. "The ring. The missing ring. Yes, not its absence, but the manner of its absence. A thief would take the papers and ignore the ring, or take the ring and ignore the papers. But here the ring vanished first, before the papers. That told me it was personal, emotional, and that pointed to the colonel. To the brother," Poirot agreed, "but not to him alone. 2 men feared Sir Alister. One sought to silence him, the other sought to succeed him. Neither trusted the other, yet both acted upon the same night. Chance, Hastings, but chance guided by character." There was a pause, filled only by the ticking of the clock. Poirot leaned back. "It is a curious thing," he said, "that when men conspire separately, they often create a more perfect crime than if they plan together. Each covers what the other forgets." "Until you arrive," I said. Poirot shrugged. "Until the little grey cells are offended." A week later, Poirot received a second letter. This one he read quickly, then handed to me. Lady Celeste had left England. She intended to live quietly abroad, relinquishing the house and title. She thanked Poirot again, this time without formality. At the end, she wrote that she would remember her husband not as he died, but as he had once been, while laughing in the conservatory before it was altered. Poirot took the letter back and burned it. "Memories," he said, "must belong to the living." As for Marrowdane House, it was closed. The servants dispersed. The conservatory was finished at last, its walls smoothed and painted, every trace of dust removed. No one would ever stand waiting there again, listening for a door. One evening, as we walked along the embankment, Poirot stopped and looked out over the river. "Hastings," he said, "do you know why men fear crimes without violence?" "Because they seem invisible," I ventured. "No," Poirot said softly. "Because they resemble ourselves. We prefer to believe that evil announces itself with noise. When it comes quietly, with courtesy, it unsettles us. He straightened, adjusting his coat against the chill. Sir Alistair believed that truth, once known, must be spoken. His error was believing that others shared his patience. "And you?" I asked. "What do you believe?" Poirot smiled, that small, private smile of his. "I believe that truth always leaves a trace. Not upon the ground, perhaps, but upon the soul. One must only know where to look." We resumed our walk, the city moving around us with indifferent grace. Somewhere behind us lay Marrodine House, already fading into rumour. Ahead, the lights of London reflected upon the water, broken yet continuous, like reason itself. Poirot walked with his usual exactness, and I followed, content in the knowledge that for all its shadows, the world still contained a mind capable of ordering them, if only for a time. 2 days after our walk along the embankment, Poirot was invited to Scotland Yard, not as a witness, but as a courtesy. Inspector Japp wished, he said, to close the file with everything in its proper place. Poirot received the invitation with approval, as though it confirmed a preference he had already formed. We sat in Japp's office while the final statements were read aloud. The language was careful, stripped of emotion, concerned with times, objects, and signed names. Colonel Marrodine had confessed to taking the ring and papers, maintaining that his brother was already dead when he entered the study. Mr. Crane admitted administering the poison, insisting he never intended death. The law would decide degrees and intent. Poirot listened without interruption, his expression neutral. When Japp finished, he leaned back. "Anything to add, Poirot?" Poirot folded his hands. "Only one thing. Sir Alistair knew he would die." Japp frowned. "That's not in the record." "It is not written," Poirot agreed, "but it is there." He explained quietly that Sir Alistair had suspected poison long before the end. The notebook, dismissed as trivial, contained dates of symptoms, notes of meals, small observations that only a suspicious mind would record. Sir Alistair had locked the door not to keep someone out, but to ensure that if he failed, no one could interfere with the conclusion he anticipated. "He staged his own death?" Japp asked. "No," Poirot said. "He accepted it. There is a difference." Japp absorbed this in silence. "You didn't mention that before." Poirot smiled faintly. "It changes nothing legally, but it restores dignity." As we left, Japp clapped Poirot on the shoulder. "You see things the rest of us miss." Poirot straightened his coat. "I see what men hide from themselves." That evening, Poirot allowed himself a small indulgence. He dined at his favorite restaurant, ordered exactly what he desired, and corrected the waiter twice without irritation. When we returned to his rooms, he paused at the door, listening. "You hear that, Hastings?" he asked. I listened. There was only the distant murmur of the street. "Nothing." "Precisely," Poirot said. Silence restored. Yet even in silence, the case lingered. I found Poirot later in his chair, eyes closed, fingers steepled. "You are thinking of Lady Celeste," I said. "Yes," he replied. "She will be free, but not light." "And Sir Alistair?" Poirot opened his eyes. He sought order. He found consequence. That is the common fate. A letter arrived a month later, not forwarded from abroad. Lady Celeste wrote briefly. She had sold Marrodine House. It would become a school. Children would run where secrets once waited. She hoped that was fitting. Poirot read the letter twice, then placed it carefully in a drawer. "That," he said, "is justice of a different kind." Time moved on as it does, smoothing sharp edges. The affair faded from conversation. Yet one afternoon, as Poirot and I shared coffee, he spoke of it again. "The most interesting crimes," he said, "are not those that succeed, but those that nearly do. They reveal the mind's ambition. And this one? I asked. This one failed because too many people believe themselves clever, Poirot replied. Cleverness is noisy. Intelligence is quiet. He smiled then, not sadly but with contentment. The little grey cells had been satisfied. The world, he for a moment, had aligned. Outside, London moved on, unaware, unconcerned. Somewhere, a conservatory caught the light cleanly on its finished walls. Somewhere, a ring lay in evidence, stripped of meaning. Somewhere, memory adjusted itself to truth. Poirot rose, straightening his jacket. "Come, Hastings," he said. "There will be another puzzle soon enough. Until then, we enjoy the order we have earned." And as we stepped out together, I reflected that the true mark of Poirot's genius was not in the solving, but in the leaving. He departed each case as he found it, with balance restored, carrying away nothing but understanding. Some weeks later, when the affair had settled into its proper shelf in memory, Poirot received a visitor who revived it unexpectedly. Miss Violet Sayers, formerly secretary to Sir Alistair, now arrived with an air of controlled urgency. She had been abroad when the death occurred, she said, and had only now returned to England. There was something she believed Poirot ought to know, something she had not realized was significant until silence gave it shape. Poirot listened without interruption, his manner encouraging but reserved. Miss Sayers explained that Sir Alistair had entrusted her with copies of correspondence, instructing her to keep them sealed unless he failed to return from a certain conversation. The conversation, she now knew, had been with Mr. Crane. She had obeyed Sir Alistair's final instruction by doing nothing, yet the weight of it troubled her conscience. She placed the packet on the table, its edges yellowed but intact. Poirot did not open it. He asked instead about Sir Alistair's habits and his moods in the weeks before his death, the manner in which he spoke of his brother and his solicitor. Miss Sayers answered precisely. Sir Alistair, she said, had been calm, even relieved, once he completed his inquiries. He believed the truth, once written, would defend itself. Poirot nodded, as though this confirmed something long settled. He told her she had done exactly as she should. The law would take care of the rest. Miss Sayers hesitated, then asked whether Sir Alistair had been afraid at the end. Poirot considered carefully before answering. Fear, he said, was present, but not dominant. Sir Alistair feared disorder more than death, and that fear had guided all his decisions. When she had gone, Poirot remained seated, hands folded, eyes thoughtful. I asked whether the letters changed anything. He replied that they changed nothing essential, yet they clarified motive. Sir Alistair had prepared for betrayal as one prepares a room for guests, arranging everything in advance. Such preparation, Poirot observed, often gives others the courage to act more quickly and with less care than they might otherwise do. That night, as we walked home, Poirot spoke of endings. He said that every case concludes twice, once when the culprit is named, and again when the meaning is understood. Most people, he remarked, are satisfied with the first ending. The second requires reflection, and reflection is uncomfortable. Marrowdean House, he believed, would trouble its new inhabitants only briefly. Children, after all, forgive buildings more readily than adults forgive one another. In the days that followed, Poirot declined new work, an unusual indulgence. He attended to small domestic matters, corrected correspondences, and restored his rooms to a state he considered ideal. I sensed that he was allowing the case to settle fully, to take its final shape within his mind. Order, once achieved, had to be maintained, even internally, lest it decay into obsession. One afternoon he surprised me by returning to the subject unprompted. The affair, he said, was notable not for ingenuity, but for restraint. No blood, no noise, no visible struggle. Such crimes depend upon social agreements, upon politeness, upon the expectation that a door opened will remain a door and not become a weapon. It was civilization itself that had been exploited. And that, Poirot said quietly, was what made it dangerous. I asked whether this made such crimes more common. Poirot replied that it made them more tempting, particularly to those who believed themselves refined. Violence, he said, was vulgar. Subtlety appealed to vanity. Yet vanity always left a mark, if only in the overconfidence of the criminal. Sir Alister's enemies had mistaken his patience for weakness. That, Poirot concluded, was the oldest error in human dealings. As spring approached, life asserted itself insistently. Invitations arrived, newspapers filled with new scandals, and memory adjusted its emphasis. Marrowdean became a reference, then a footnote. Poirot accepted this with equanimity. To solve a mystery was not to preserve it. He preferred resolution to remembrance, clarity to commemoration. When asked if he ever revisited old cases in thought, he answered that he revisited conclusions, not events. And on the last evening before we left London for a brief holiday, Poirot stood once more by the window, watching lamps appear along the street. He spoke without turning, saying that the affair at Marrowdean would endure for him as a reminder, not of cleverness, but of responsibility. The detective, he said, must not only discover truth, but decide how much of it the world requires. Too much truth could wound as deeply as lies. I did not fully understand him then. I believe now that I do. The night was calm, the city orderly, and Poirot seemed satisfied to let the past remain precisely where it belonged, resolved, contained, and no longer demanding the labor of his little grey cells. With that assurance, he turned away, and the window reflected not a detective, but a man at peace. It was enough, and I followed him gladly into the quiet continuation of ordinary days that awaited us without further questions or regrets from then. The holiday Poirot proposed took us not abroad but into stillness, to a small coastal town where the sea maintained a discipline of tides and the air smelled of salt and routine. We arrived on a pale morning, the station nearly empty, and walked to our lodging with bags lightened by the absence of duty. Poirot approved of the place immediately. It possessed, he said, a clarity of outline that encouraged thought without demanding it. For 2 days he refused all discussion of Marrowdean. He read, he walked, he arranged pebbles on the window-sill of our room until their colors pleased him. Only on the 3rd evening, as the sun lowered itself with ceremonial care, did he speak of the affair again, and then only because it had followed us. A gentleman had recognized him on the promenade and, with the intimacy of strangers, asked whether the story in the papers was true. Poirot answered with courtesy and finality. Later, over tea, he explained to me that stories were inevitable. They were how society processed disturbance. What mattered was not accuracy, but containment. Crimes like Marrowdean, he said, frighten people because they suggest that control is an illusion. A man sits at his desk, the door locked, the world orderly, and yet something enters. It is not the poison they fear, Hastings. It is the invitation. I asked whether Sir Alister had invited his own end. Poirot considered the sea for a long moment. He invited truth, he said. Death merely accepted the summons first. That night, and as we dined at a modest restaurant overlooking the harbour, Poirot was uncharacteristically expansive. He spoke of his early cases, of the difference between solving and understanding, of the temptation to believe that intelligence alone could civilize the world. Intelligence, he said, was a tool. Without humility, it became a blade turned inward. You see, he continued, Sir Alister believed that by knowing everything, he could control everything. His brother believed blood excused action. The solicitor believed cleverness erased consequence. Each was wrong, but each was sincere. That is why the affair troubles me. The next morning brought a letter forwarded from London. It bore the stamp of the inquest office and contained a final note appended to the record. The verdict had been amended slightly to acknowledge contributory actions. Sir Poirot read it once, then placed it carefully into his pocket. He did not mention it again. We spent the remainder of the week in agreeable quiet. Poirot declined even the mild puzzles presented by local gossip. He said the mind, like a room, required intervals of emptiness. When at last we prepared to return, he stood for a final moment by the water, watching the horizon perform its daily division. "Order," he said, "is not permanence. It is balance, renewed each day. That is why it is precious." Back in London, life resumed its accustomed pace. Poirot returned to his rooms, to his correspondence, to the small rituals that marked his days. Yet I observed a subtle change. He was, if anything, more exacting than before, but also more patient. He listened longer. He interrupted less, and it was as though the affair had refined his precision rather than sharpened it. One afternoon, a parcel arrived containing the Marodine signet ring, released from evidence. There was a note from the clerk asking whether Poirot wished to claim it on behalf of Lady Celeste. Poirot held the ring briefly, weighing it, then placed it back in its case. "It has served its purpose," he said. "Symbols must not linger." He arranged for it to be sent abroad, without message or explanation. "She will know," he said simply. That evening, as we sat together, I asked him whether he ever doubted. He smiled, not dismissively, but with candor. Doubt, he said, was the companion of reason. Certainty belonged to fools and fanatics. What mattered was not doubt's absence, but its management. "The little grey cells," he said, tapping his forehead, "and says they do not shout. They whisper. One must create silence to hear them." The city outside hummed with indifferent life. Somewhere another locked room waited, another orderly death prepared its deception. Poirot did not hurry toward it. He allowed the present moment its completeness. At last, he rose and aligned his gloves, the gesture that signaled closure. "Hastings," he said, "we have spoken enough of Marodine. It is finished." And so it was. The affair remained, in my memory, not as a spectacle of revelation, but as a study in restraint. There had been no dramatic confession, no final cry, only the steady assembling of motive, opportunity, and human weakness until truth stood revealed by its own coherence. Poirot extinguished the lamp and wished me good night. As I lay awake, and I reflected that some mysteries ended not with astonishment, but with understanding, that, perhaps, was the greater achievement. In the morning, the world would continue, imperfect and intricate. Somewhere within it walked a small man with immaculate mustaches and an unyielding respect for order, ready to listen for the whisper beneath appearances. And knowing that, I slept, content that for all its shadows, reason remained among us, patient, precise, and quietly undefeated. In later years, when I recalled that case, it was never the locked door or the missing ring that returned first, but Poirot's refusal to dramatize suffering. He understood that justice performed loudly often served vanity more than truth. By allowing events to settle into proportion, he gave those left behind a chance to live with knowledge rather than spectacle. And the world, he knew, did not improve through astonishment alone. It improved through careful seeing, patient listening, and the courage to accept conclusions that lacked comfort. That lesson remained with me, quiet but durable, a discipline like the tides themselves. Whenever I think of Poirot now, I recall not his triumphs, but his pauses, moments when understanding arrived softly and order was restored without applause or display from those observing nearby quietly. The conclusion came not with a summons or a confession, but with a quiet afternoon in Poirot's rooms, the curtains half drawn, the city reduced to a muted murmur beyond the glass. Poirot sat opposite me, hands folded, his expression one of composed finality. The affair at Marrodine, he said, had reached its true end not when the culprits were named, but when all its meanings had been placed where they belonged. He spoke then, deliberately, of Sir Alister's last evening. The man had known, Poirot said, that the danger lay not in exposure alone, but in delay. His error was not moral weakness, but intellectual pride. He believed himself capable of arranging truth so perfectly that it would wait upon his convenience. In doing so, he underestimated the impatience of those whose interests were threatened. That miscalculation, Poirot observed, was the quiet engine of the crime. The locked door, the tidy desk, the absence of disturbance had not been designed to deceive investigators, but to reassure Sir Alister himself. Order had been his defense against fear. When Mr. Crane arrived with poison disguised as comfort, Sir Alister accepted it because it preserved dignity. That when Colonel Marrodine followed, he acted not from calculation, but from panic born of entitlement. Each man believed he acted alone. Each relied upon the other's existence without knowing it. Poirot explained that this convergence of separate intentions created the illusion of an immaculate crime. One man supplied the method, another supplied concealment, and the victim supplied the setting. The absence of violence was not restraint, but convenience. Violence would have required courage. Politeness required only habit. That, Poirot said, was the most unsettling aspect of the affair. Lady Celeste's role, too, had resolved itself with painful clarity. She had suspected discord, but not danger. Her instinct had been to retreat, not to intervene, and in that withdrawal, the final opportunity for prevention had been lost. And Poirot did not condemn her. He said that fear often expresses itself as silence, and silence is rarely recognized as action until it is too late. As he spoke, Poirot arranged the objects on the table between us, aligning them with quiet precision. He said that the final gathering at Marrodine had not been intended as a performance, but as a necessity. Truth required an audience only because lies depend upon isolation. By placing all participants together, he allowed contradiction to reveal itself without force. The guilty exposed themselves through discomfort, not accusation. I asked him whether he felt satisfaction in such endings. Poirot considered carefully before answering. Satisfaction, he said, belonged to vanity. What he felt was completion. A pattern had been discerned, named, and set aside. That was enough. And to linger over triumph would disturb the balance he worked to restore. He added that justice, when performed loudly, often displaced responsibility. In this case, restraint allowed each participant to confront his own reflection. Mr. Crane faced the consequences of cleverness unmoored from conscience. Colonel Marrodine confronted the emptiness of inherited privilege stripped of moral authority. Lady Celeste confronted survival without illusion. Sir Alister, though dead, achieved what he valued most: clarity. Poirot rose and went to the window, gazing out with the air of a man concluding a private conversation. He said that crimes which leave no trace on the ground always leave the deepest impressions on those who observe them. They remind us that evil does not require chaos, only permission, and a door unlocked in trust can be as dangerous as one forced open in rage. He turned back to me then, his expression softened by reflection. The task of the detective, he said, was not to dramatize darkness, but to reduce it. By understanding motive and method, one diminished their power to recur. The goal was never spectacle, but prevention, even if prevention arrived too late for the present case. When at last he declared the affair closed, there was no ceremony. He placed his gloves together, adjusted them, and nodded once as if acknowledging an internal agreement. The Marrodine case, he said, would remain with him not as a puzzle, but as a reminder of the fragility of order when intelligence forgets humility. We spoke no more of it that evening. As I prepared to leave, Poirot wished me good night with customary politeness. The room, so restored to symmetry, held no residue of the turmoil it had once contained in conversation. Outside, the city continued, indifferent and alive. In the days that followed, life resumed its familiar rhythms. Yet I found that the affair lingered in my thoughts, not through its mechanics, but through its restraint. There had been no dramatic unmasking, no theatrical collapse. Instead, there had been understanding, measured and exact, delivered with respect for both truth and those compelled to live with it. Looking back now, I recognize that this was Poirot's greatest gift. He did not merely solve mysteries, he returned them to human scale. He allowed suffering to be acknowledged without being exploited, and resolution to occur without display. In doing so, he affirmed his belief that reason, applied with patience and compassion, could still hold its ground against disorder. That belief remains with me. Whenever I recall Hercule Poirot, it is not the brilliance of his deductions that first comes to mind, but the quiet authority with which he concluded them. He understood that endings need not astonish to endure. They must simply be true.